There are ideas that merely inform the mind, and then there are ideas that arrive like a fracture in the glass of ordinary perception. They do not simply give you new information, they rearrange the architecture through which you have been seeing your life. The title before us, "They Buried This Ancient Truth About the Soul Because It Makes You Impossible to Control," belongs to that second category. It does not ask to be skimmed. It presses on something older than opinion, older than ideology, older even than language's neat little cages. It points toward a forgotten center in the human being, a place that many have sensed in moments of stillness, grief, awe, or impossible recognition, but that few have been taught how to name without distortion. What if the deepest truth about you is not that you are fragile, programmable, and fundamentally incomplete, but that beneath all conditioning there exists something in you that cannot be domesticated by fear? What if the soul is not a decorative spiritual concept, but the one fact about human existence that threatens every system built on inner amnesia? To begin here is to enter a chamber hidden beneath the public cathedral of reality. Above ground, the world appears busy with surfaces, identities, schedules, transactions, headlines, ambitions, roles, labels, and inherited scripts. But beneath that visible machinery there has always been another current, moving silently like an underground river through civilizations, myths, sacred texts, initiatory traditions, and private awakenings. The ancients hinted at it with symbols, because direct speech often fails where truth becomes too alive to be reduced. They spoke of sparks hidden in clay, divine breath trapped in dust, stars buried in the heart, sleeping kings, forgotten names, and doors concealed behind the veil of the ordinary. These were not poetic ornaments alone. They were maps. They were warnings. They were reminders left like glowing embers for those who would one day need to remember what had been covered over. And covered over it has been, not always through dramatic conspiracy, but through something perhaps even more powerful: repetition. The most effective prison is not the one that announces itself as captivity, but the one that trains its inhabitants to call limitation normal. If a child is raised to believe that they are only a body, only a biography, only a social role, only a bundle of reactions and survival instincts, then the soul becomes an abstraction at best, an irrelevance at worst. If entire cultures reward external compliance while neglecting inner sovereignty, then the human being slowly forgets that there is a dimension of self no institution can manufacture. The burial of truth is often less like locking a scroll in a vault and more like surrounding a person with so much noise, urgency, and fragmentation that they never hear the quiet, indestructible note resounding within themselves. This is why the question of the soul is not merely religious or mystical. It is practical in the deepest possible sense. Your understanding of what you are determines the quality of every decision you make. If you believe yourself to be only a temporary arrangement of impulses trying to survive in a hostile world, you will likely live from fear, scarcity, comparison, and exhaustion. You will bargain with your own integrity for approval. You will mistake stimulation for meaning and obedience for belonging. But if you begin to suspect that there is in you an essence prior to conditioning, a witnessing presence that cannot be reduced to the social self, then an entirely different way of living becomes possible. You stop negotiating so easily with falsehood. You become harder to manipulate because you are no longer seeking your value from the systems that profit from your doubt. The person who remembers the soul becomes difficult to govern through shame, seduction, panic, and manufactured identity because they have touched something in themselves that does not depend on permission. That is why this inquiry feels cosmic and immediate at the same time. It touches the stars and your morning decisions in one movement. The ancient truth about the soul is not hidden in some remote heaven, inaccessible except to monks and mystics withdrawn from life. It is hidden in the middle of your own experience, disguised by familiarity. It waits in the silence between thoughts, in the strange stillness beneath emotional storms, in the intuition that speaks before logic arranges its defenses. It reveals itself in those moments when life suddenly feels transparent, and you sense that your personality is only the clothing, not the wearer. Perhaps you have felt it while staring at the night sky and realizing that your loneliness is somehow not ultimate. Perhaps in grief, when everything superficial falls away and something wordless remains. Perhaps in love, when another person's presence seems to awaken a memory older than this lifetime story. The soul often appears not as a theory first, but as a recognition, a shock of intimacy with something you somehow already knew. And yet the modern world has become remarkably efficient at distracting us from such recognitions. It trains attention outward, fragments identity into marketable categories, and teaches people to curate themselves rather than encounter themselves. It makes the mirror more important than the face, the profile more important than the presence, the performance more important than the being. In such a climate, the soul becomes inconvenient because it cannot be optimized, branded, or neatly assimilated into systems of external validation. The soul introduces a dangerous question into the machinery of control. What if the deepest authority in a person does not come from outside at all? What if beneath habit and fear there is an inner axis aligned with truth itself? A person anchored there may still participate in society, but they cannot be wholly possessed by it. They may work, love, grieve, create, and struggle like anyone else, but they no longer confuse the stage with the source. So this exploration is not an escape from reality. It is a descent into a more complete reality, one in which the visible world is not denied but reinterpreted. We will move through the hidden assumptions that keep the soul buried, the symbolic languages through which ancient wisdom preserved this knowledge, the inner consequences of forgetting, and the outer consequences of remembering. We will look at why the soul has so often been reduced to doctrine, sentiment, or metaphor, and why reclaiming it may be one of the most radical acts available to a human being in an age of psychological capture. Because to know yourself as more than a conditioned identity is not to become passive. It is to become ungovernable in the deepest sense, not through rebellion for its own sake, but through alignment with something truer than fear. And perhaps that is the real threshold before us. Not whether the soul exists as an idea to be debated, but whether you are willing to consider that the oldest secret is also the nearest one. That beneath your roles, beneath your wounds, beneath the names given to you by family, culture, history, and even your own past, there is a living center that was never broken in the way you were taught to believe. Something luminous, something ancient, something that can be obscured but not erased. If that is true, then the burial of this truth was never final. It was only temporary, waiting for the moment when enough pressure, enough longing, enough dissatisfaction with the surface would force the hidden seed to break open in the dark. If the introduction opened a hidden doorway, then this section steps through it and lingers long enough for the eyes to adjust. The phrase "they buried this ancient truth about the soul because it makes you impossible to control" carries within it several intertwined currents, and each one reveals another chamber beneath the visible architecture of life. At the heart of it is a simple but destabilizing proposition. The soul is not merely the emotional core of a person, nor a sentimental abstraction used to soften the harsh edges of mortality. The soul, in the older and more dangerous sense, is the unmanufactured essence of being, the interior reality within you that precedes social conditioning and survives every costume the world persuades you to wear. It is the part of you that can inhabit a role without becoming reducible to it, that can witness thought without being identical to thought, that can move through time without being entirely defined by time's events. To understand why this matters, one must first recognize the central illusion around which so much of human life is organized. The illusion is not simply that people are lied to in obvious ways. The deeper illusion is identification. Most forms of control do not begin by chaining the body. They begin by colonizing the self-image. They persuade a human being to confuse their essence with their conditioning. Once this confusion hardens, manipulation becomes almost effortless. A person who believes they are nothing more than their fears can be ruled by fear. A person who believes they are nothing more than their social reflection can be ruled by approval and rejection. A person who believes they are only the story they have inherited can be kept loyal to patterns that harm them, simply because those patterns feel familiar. Control does not require omnipotent force when inner misidentification has already done most of the work. This is why the soul has always stood in tension with systems of domination. The soul introduces a vertical axis into a world obsessed with horizontal pressures. Horizontally, One is pushed and pulled by status, anxiety, comparison, reward, punishment, and the endless weather of collective moods. But vertically, there is another orientation altogether, one that connects the person not merely to society, but to being itself. Ancient traditions used different names for this axis. Some called it spirit, some the divine spark, some the inner light, some the image of God, some pure awareness, some the unborn essence. The names vary because language bends around mystery in different cultural forms, but the intuition remains strikingly similar. There is in the human being a depth that belongs not to the world of manufacture, but to the world of origin. And whoever remembers that depth becomes less susceptible to psychological capture. Another core theme here is the difference between personality and presence. Personality is not the enemy. It is simply the mask shaped by genetics, memory, environment, adaptation, and personal history. It is useful, expressive, and often beautiful, but it is not the whole. Presence is deeper. Presence is what remains when the mind's performances grow quiet enough for being itself to be felt. In ordinary life, many people move as though personality is all there is, endlessly polishing, defending, and narrating it. But the old wisdom traditions repeatedly insisted that the personality is more like weather moving across the sky of a greater self. Storms may come, identities may shift, beliefs may collapse, status may rise and fall, but the sky remains. To live from the soul is to begin relocating one's center of gravity from the storm to the sky. This shift is not merely inward in a vague or private sense. It alters how reality itself is perceived. One of the ancient truths buried beneath the noise of modern consciousness is that attention is not passive. What you consistently attend to does not simply inform you, it shapes the world you inhabit. A soul-forgetting culture trains attention toward surfaces, toward fear cycles, toward external authority, toward scarcity and fragmentation. This produces a person whose energy is continually siphoned outward. They become easier to predict because their reactions are externally triggered. But when a person begins to reclaim inner attention, something remarkable happens. They no longer leak themselves so easily into every demand, outrage, seduction, or collective trance. They become able to witness before reacting, to discern before complying, to sense the difference between what agitates them and what is true. In this sense, remembrance of the soul restores a kind of interior authorship. There is also a profound tension between memory and amnesia woven into this topic. The ancient truth about the soul often feels less like learning something new and more like remembering something forgotten. That feeling is crucial. It suggests that awakening is not the importation of foreign knowledge into an empty vessel, but the recovery of buried knowing from within. Myths across cultures echo this structure. The exile who forgets their royal origin, the wanderer who carries a hidden name, the sleeping heir who must be awakened, the divine child concealed among ordinary circumstances. These stories endure because they dramatize an interior fact. The human being, in many wisdom traditions, is not empty and waiting to be completed by external systems. The human being is full of concealed inheritance and waiting to remember. If this is true, then the most effective form of control would be to keep people in a state of spiritual amnesia, busy enough and divided enough to never reclaim their own depth. Another theme that must be faced honestly is fear. Why would the truth of the soul be buried at all? Because fear-based structures depend on people remaining estranged from their intrinsic worth and intelligence. A person disconnected from the soul is perpetually easier to sell to, easier to frighten, easier to shame, easier to herd into identities that can be managed. They seek completion through consumption, belonging through conformity, and certainty through external permission. But the soul carries another kind of certainty, not ideological rigidity, but an unborrowed inner knowing. This is not arrogance. In fact, genuine contact with the soul often humbles the personality because it reveals how small the constructed self really is compared to the vastness moving through it. Yet this humility is not weakness. It is freedom from the desperate need to be constantly authorized by the crowd. There is also the paradox of hiddenness itself. Truths of the soul are not hidden merely because someone somewhere concealed them maliciously. They are also hidden because the mode of consciousness required to perceive them is rare in a distracted world. You can place a mirror in front of a person, but if they never become still, they may never truly see their face. So too with the soul. It is not absent. It is obscured by speed, noise, and identification. The burial, then, is cultural, psychological, and existential. It occurs through inherited language that narrows reality, through institutions that privilege conformity over interior development, through trauma that teaches the self to contract for survival, and through habits of mind that mistake familiarity for truth. To reclaim the soul is therefore not simply to adopt a new belief system. It is to undergo a reorientation of perception. And beneath all of these themes is perhaps the most unsettling and liberating one of all. What if the deepest layer of your being cannot be owned? What if it can be wounded in expression but never corrupted in essence? What if all the mechanisms that shape behavior still fail to touch the innermost center from which real freedom arises? This does not mean life becomes painless or easy. It means there is a place within you that remains prior to damage, prior even to the narratives built around damage. The ancients often described this not to deny suffering, but to prevent human beings from making an idol of their suffering. The soul is the witness fire that survives the collapse of false identities. It is the secret in you that cannot be mass-produced. To follow this idea fully is to begin seeing the world differently. The social order is no longer the ultimate frame of meaning, but one layer among others. Personal history is no longer destiny, but one movement in a larger unfolding. Desire is no longer always trustworthy, fear is no longer always authoritative, and consensus is no longer the same as truth. The person who begins to grasp this does not necessarily withdraw from life. On the contrary, they may enter it more fully, but from a deeper center, less hypnotized by appearances. They become capable of living in the world without entirely belonging to its illusions. And that, perhaps, is precisely why the old truth remains so potent. The soul remembered is not convenient. It is not market-friendly. It does not make one superior, but it does make one inwardly difficult to command.